A few weeks ago, I paid a visit to the renowned biologist Rupert Sheldrake. He's been on my show before, but those conversations were all recorded online. So when I found myself in London for a couple of days this summer, I dropped by his place for a cup of tea. Finally meeting in person, we started off just catching up, talking about our lives and some shared interests. After a while, the conversation also turned to some of the bigger challenges we face today in humanity's collective search for truth on the intersection of spirituality and science. That seemed like a topic that might be of interest for a wider public, so I decided to record that part of our conversation. And I'm glad I did. Considering Rupert's personal history, few people seem more suited to discuss some of the issues that the so-called post-truth era confronts us with. On the one hand, he spent decades pushing the boundaries of biology, life and consciousness, despite fierce opposition from hardline skeptics who dismiss anything that challenges the orthodoxy of mechanistic materialism. On the other hand, he's always remained a scientist at heart. Even as his work gained traction in spiritual circles, he did not start catering to a more, let's say, woo-woo spirituality that bases itself merely on intuition or personal experience. Even when exploring topics like telepathy or other paranormal phenomena, his approach always remained grounded in research. So I was wondering, what can we learn from Rupert's lifelong journey? How did he manage to stay balanced in his pursuit of truth? How might his approach help us navigate these confusing times in which we are constantly bombarded with competing ideas, theories, and truth claims? It's not always easy to separate the solid and the genuinely interesting from the flimsy and the nonsensical. But maybe some of Rupert's strategies can inspire us to do just that. So without any further ado, here's our conversation. Hopefully it will offer you some inspiration as well. So Rupert, you've always been a scientist. You did your studies as a biologist. You went to India, as you have often told. You did your research and so on. And then you, like most people know by now, you wrote your book. What was the original title again?
New Science of Life.
Yeah. And then it took about a year, 2 years before the editor of Nature wrote his damning piece.
Oh, it didn't take a year. No, it took 3 months after the book was published before it was condemned by the editor of Nature in a famous editorial called A Book for Burning.
Mm-hmm. And ever since, I guess you were somehow banished from... Did you actually feel... That's a good question. Did you feel banished from the scientific community?
Well, his attack on me was an attempt to excommunicate me from the scientific community. And it did have that effect, yes. It meant that I couldn't get lab space, I couldn't get grants. And people were very reluctant to invite me to give seminars at universities because some of their colleagues would immediately object and say that I was a pseudoscientist or a charlatan, and they would bring the university into disrepute. So yes, it had a big effect. Mm-hmm. It didn't have much effect on my closest scientific friends, who remained good friends, nor on my closest scientific or academic association. I was a fellow of Clare College, Cambridge. I continued to dine on High Table and hang out with people there. I still do. And they all treated it as a bit of a joke, the attack and so on. I mean, they remained good friends and have been very helpful. So it didn't have that effect on everyone. And I've always had a lot of scientists who are friendly towards what I do, but usually in private rather than public.
Mm. And then at what point in time, if after 3 months the editor of Nature wrote his piece, then that happened to you academically speaking and so on, you were kind of out of work because you couldn't get grants. Did your book immediately start selling well among the more, let's say, spiritually inclined and in those days New Age circles and so on?
Oh, yes. I mean, the sales took off enormously after the attack by the editor of Nature.
Did that just happen by itself, or was there first this? In, I would think there would first have to be this kind of rhetoric somewhere in the media about, oh, this is the man who upset the scientific community.
Oh, yes, there was a lot of that. When the book first came out, the reception was quite favorable. New Scientist magazine asked me to do an article about the theory. There were good reviews in The Guardian and a lot of newspapers, and it was taken very seriously and with the kind of intelligent discussion I'd hoped for. But the editor of Nature, who was a militant materialist, attacked it precisely because it was getting such favorable attention. He wanted to put an end to that, which he did, more or less. So after that, because it was attacked, I mean, when his attack came out at a leading editorial in Nature, on the front page of Nature, it caused a lot of publicity. I mean, that same day, I was asked to appear on BBC News programme in a debate with the editor of Nature, which I did. And so there was a lot of publicity in the mainstream media. And a lot of people liked the hypothesis and were very friendly. So it wasn't as if everyone was hostile. They weren't. The people who were most friendly when the book first came out in 1981, in terms of organized groups, were Jungian societies, because followers of the psychologist Jung are keen on the idea of collective memory, the collective unconscious, and
of course,
they liked the idea of morphic resonance. And I also became friendly with a number of people in California. I was invited to give seminars at the Esalen Institute, which is then, as now, a kind of pioneering human potential center. And I met Terence McKenna and Ralph Abraham, with whom I had a long series of three-way dialogues called the Trialogues, which were enormously stimulating conversations, and books based on those are still in print today, more than 30, even 40 years after we had the actual conversations. So there was both an attack on what I was doing, but also an opening to whole new horizons of discussion and engagement.
So then we've got the Jungians, we've got people like Terence McKenna, we've got Esalen. We're in the midst of the spiritual world of the 80s. And how shall I phrase my question? How come, that's my basic question, how come you didn't fall prey to what today is called audience capture? Because I could imagine you going full frontal all the way into that kind of spiritual world and write other books which cater to what that type of public wants to hear. And when I use that type of public, I mean it in its broadest sense. There's lots of people with very interesting ideas, but there's also a whole group of people who are just a bit of, I'm looking for the English word. In Dutch, we would call it floaty, this kind of an unbased view of reality, but just picking and choosing some scientific sounding words just to prop up their own unfounded spiritual views of life. So how come you didn't fall prey to what many people might have fallen prey to if you don't find a job within the field that you come out of, then trying to get some monetization out of another field that, in which, let's be clear, there's lots of books being sold as well?
Well, the thing is, my main focus was on the scientific research and the scientific hypothesis. And my first book, A New Science of Life, came out in 1981. But then I continued to develop ideas about morphic resonance. And my second book, The Presence of the Past, which is my main theoretical book about morphic resonance, came out in 1988. And so my main focus in those years was evidence for morphic resonance, scientific tests. Then, in terms of research, I found that there were several people who offered me grants. The first was Lawrence Rockefeller, the philanthropist. And after that, a number of wealthy people who liked my work offered me grants for research. This was not to support myself. I could support myself from lecture fees, and I'm fortunate to have inherited a small private income from my parents. So I was more independent than I might have been if I'd depended entirely on a salary. And that was a huge help. So the research grants I had, and which I still receive from different people now, enabled me to do research and carry on with experimental programs, which have always been my primary focus. In terms of the sort of rather unrooted New Age spirituality, I wasn't particularly drawn to it, partly because I already had a spiritual path. When I went to India first in 1968, I first went to India, I got very interested in Indian meditation, yoga and meditation. When I was working in India from 1974 on and off till 1985, I was working part-time in the 80s. I was drawn very much towards Hindu philosophy, but then realized that actually, given my background, my ancestry, my own culture, it made more sense to find my way back to a Christian path in which I was brought up originally. And so I was actually confirmed at the age of 34 in the Church of South India. And I then discovered the person who, for me, was the perfect spiritual teacher, namely Father Bede Griffiths, who was a British Benedictine monk living in a small ashram in South India. He'd been in India for 30 years and was really bridging the world of Hindu philosophy, yoga, meditation with the Christian mystical tradition. And for me, that was the ideal solution to what I wanted to find, a way of having a mystical dimension to Christianity that ordinary churches hadn't shown me before, but which he revealed to me very clearly, and where there's a kind of bridge with the mystical traditions of Buddhism, Hinduism, and indeed Sufism. So this, for me, meant I had a Christian path, which was a kind of anchor. And I always make the practice of going to church on Sundays wherever I am and observing the liturgical year and the Christian festivals, and I pray every day. So this path meant that I wasn't so easily sort of swayed by, the latest New Age theory of this or that. I wasn't lost, searching for something, going in any direction. I had a path which was a fairly solid foundation for my life.
Actually, how did Bede do it? Because Bede Griffiths, the same thing, of course. In his case, he was very recuperated by more New Agey spiritual groups as well, but he was extremely rooted within his own Christianity. If you read his books, yes, he quotes Shankara and all the Hindu philosophers, but he's well read in Thomas Aquinas and people like that. So he really knows his Christian past, let's say. Also, if you read his autobiography, it's clear enough how rooted he is in the tradition. But do you remember how? Because I would suppose that his ashram was also being swarmed by the more free-floating, not that there's any problem with it, but, well, sometimes there is a problem. When it becomes spirituality which has no solidity about it or in it, then often you get people who are also not rooted, strangely enough, not rooted within themselves, because the only thing that they can see is themselves. That's to say, it's only their intuition and their feeling of the world which creates the only reality and the only truth. And when you encounter those people, it's my experience that those people really don't have any solid ground within themselves, although they claim to only live from within. I'm not always sure that they do. And I could imagine that the ashram of Bede was full of those types of seekers who only follow their own intuitions and feelings. And how did Bede?
Well, actually, there were a few like that, but there weren't that many, because in India, most Western spiritual seekers who went to India were not interested in Christianity. Most of them had come from Christian backgrounds. They've been educated at universities, which nearly always means people get taught that Christianity is silly, only for feeble-minded people, out of date. There's a very strong anti-Christian bias within Western secular academic life. And many of them, like many people in the New Age movement, worked on the ABC principle, anything but Christian. So, the shamanic dream catchers, kirtan chanting, Tibetan mantras, anything as long as it's not Christian. So there were many, many people of that kind at the ashram of Sai Baba, for example, or of other Hindu gurus or Tibetan teachers in Dharamsala and elsewhere. But most of them didn't come to the Christian ashram precisely because it was Christian. So, ironically, Bede's ashram was mostly populated by Indian Christians, including Roman Catholic nuns who went there for retreats and who were doing work rather like Mother Teresa, looking after the poor and the needy. So, of all the ashrams I visited in India, ironically, his Christian ashram was the most Indian, with the majority of people there Indian, whereas when I went to Sai Baba's centers or other ashrams, Ramana Maharishi ashram in Tiruvannamalai, most people there were Western spiritual seekers.
Interesting.
So it wasn't actually overwhelmed with New Agey people. But when such people did arrive, Father Bede always was open to talking to people. He asked them what their aspirations were and what they were looking for and so on. But what he did was modeled a life grounded in a tradition.
Mm.
I mean, the ashram was a Benedictine community, and there were 5 periods of prayer or meditation a day and 2 periods of actual silent meditation. And so the whole thing was based on this liturgical year and on the rhythm of the life of a monastic community. So insofar as people participated in that life, they had a grounding in a tradition.
Mm. That's interesting because, of course, I know he was rooted in his Benedictine tradition and the way he, the ashram itself is an interesting combination between an Indian ashram and a Christian monastery, and so it has this rhythm of prayer and rootedness in the tradition. But in his books, for example, he mentions people like Ken Wilber, he mentions Fritjof Capra, he refers to your book. So it was also interesting how his books in the late 80s do incorporate some of the, let's say, bestsellers of the New Age world of those days. So he, in his thinking at least, he was open to it and he had a certain dialogue with it.
Well, he was open to it because he liked to know what was happening in the intellectual world. What he could see from reading Fritjof Capra and was that quantum physics was not just like old-style mechanistic physics. There was something new about quantum physics that was a new opening for science, and that he was excited by that. In Ken Wilber's work, he found an attempt to make a more holistic philosophical synthesis appropriate to the modern world, which he thought was a massive step forward from sort of analytical philosophy of Oxford and Cambridge and this sort of very narrow linguistic word-chopping type of philosophy with no sense of metaphysics or a bigger dimension. So he saw all these things as movements in the right direction towards a more holistic worldview. He didn't think they were the ultimate answer, but he was interested because they were an opening up of the world in which he grew up was one where mechanistic materialism was completely dominant in the intellectual world. And, in the 1950s and 60s in the intellectual world of England, religion, especially Christianity, was sort of pushed off into a kind of small enclave and the assumption was that, religion will just die away as everyone sees the light of reason and science. And as in the Soviet Union, they thought that, just a few old women in a few old semi-ruined churches and the whole thing will wither away. That was the usual assumption. And I think he saw these holistic movements of the New Age as a breaking out of that towards a more inclusive form of spiritual understanding. And I think he was well aware that some of them were superficial philosophically. but he thought they were a move in the right direction, away from reductive materialism.
Mm. Oh, we mentioned Fritjof Capra, and let me perhaps kind of zoom in, not on Capra himself, but on the idea of quantum mechanics and quantum physics, because that's probably the best example of how there is something really there that should flabbergast any spiritually inclined and philosophically inclined mind and scientifically inclined mind. And on the other hand, I guess it's the most abused part of science when it comes to spirituality, or don't you have that feeling?
Well, I think quantum theory is a radical break with what went before within science. I mean, that's a pretty conventional view, which I share. But I think it's also been used by a lot of people, the quantum society, the quantum self, quantum medicine, quantum this, quantum that, as a kind of way of borrowing a term from science, making New Agey views look scientific. And in that sense, it's pseudoscience. So I think it's been very much abused. And most people don't understand quantum physics. Even lots of physicists don't understand it. So, but many of these superficial attempts to incorporate it into theories of reality or consciousness and stuff are scientifically inadequate and philosophically inadequate, but they look persuasive to people who don't know much about science. So I myself avoid that terminology because I'm instantly suspicious when someone brands something quantum this or quantum that.
Mm-hmm. How did you separate the scientific from the pseudoscientific? Because it really wasn't easy considering your position of being tarnished on the one side by a certain side of the scientific community, on the other hand being embraced by New Age elements that are not always philosophically and scientifically sophisticated when dealing with certain terms like quantum. Of course, you're a biologist, but so how did you do it? How did you, and can we learn something from it for these days which are called the post-truth era? So how did you separate the good from the bad when it comes to seeking truth and science and pseudoscience and so on?
I think for me, the key and rather conventional question is, what empirical evidence is there? And right from the beginning, I've been very clear that morphic resonance is a empirically testable hypothesis. You can test it in the realm of chemical crystallization, melting points, animal behavior, protein folding, low temperature physics. In the third edition of my book, A New Science of Life, I have an appendix with 10 new tests for morphic resonance. And I spend a lot of my time trying to do experiments. That's what I actually do most of the time, is empirical research. And I publish a lot of papers in peer-reviewed journals. So I follow those procedures because I think that's the key thing in science, to have empirical tests. And now there's certainly no shortage of theories. Now, with the advent of artificial intelligence, lots of people have decided they can create theories of everything by putting in, a theory. Give me a theory of everything based on consciousness, quantum theory, morphic resonance, holistic science, etc. And sure enough, in a few minutes, artificial intelligence produces a theory. And once they've got the theory, then what do they do with it? Well, one of the things, unfortunately, they think of is, send it to Rupert Sheldrake. So I now have, just today, this very day, I've had 5 theories in my inbox just in one day. Last week I had about 10 in the week. I got 5 in one day now. And they're all theories that, part of them is all good, holistic. They do include morphic resonance. They include resonant fields. They include lots of things that I think really are there. But the people who produce them think they're the only person who's come up with the answer to everything. They have very little historical perspective. They have no way of relating it to the rest of science. And I now have to reply to people saying, I'm just sorry, I just can't comment in detail on this theory because, I just had 5 today. And if I read them all, it would be a full-time job, more than a full-time job. And for me, the key question, which I say to all the people who send me these theories, is what empirical predictions does it make that differ from those of other theories? And what can you yourself do to actually test it? There's a superabundance of theories, but a great shortage of empirical research on these subjects. So for me, the question is, not having a beautiful theory that weaves together quantum theory, consciousness, ultimate purpose, relational dynamics in society, etc. They all contain these, all good things. Not to have yet another theory, but to have some new data that can actually move on the debate. We won't get any further with new theories. They're now so common that, if you opened a website where people could publish these theories, I think someone should do it actually and get artificial intelligence to classify them. And there's just so many theories now. It used to be quite rare that people came up with holistic theories, but it's now extremely common.
On the one hand, what you say that your answer is basically simple. It's what's your experiments, what's your proof for it, your argumentative proof. So that seems like a very obvious answer, but it's completely antithetical to what I said, that lots of people these days kind of go from their intuition and they don't need to prove because they know on the inside in some level. And that's not just a problem with the spiritually inclined, let's say. It's just the same with MAGA people and Trump himself and people like that. Oh, it's my truth because I posit it as a truth and because in the deepest depth of myself I feel it to be a truth. So I guess my question is, do you have any experience in convincing the intuition people, let me call them that way for a second, to still properly look at the evidence and be more empirical? How do you get them to the side of some more grounded empiricism?
Well, some people don't want to have grounded empiricism. I think one way of doing it, which I haven't done yet because I haven't got the time or energy, would be to do what I just mentioned, set up a website, or I thought of calling it a theatre of theories, where anyone who wants to can publish their theory. There'd be hundreds, maybe thousands, and classify them, have artificial intelligence classify them. And then it'll be obvious to people, which isn't obvious to them at the moment, that their theory is just one of hundreds of theories, all of which are making claims based on intuition, artificial intelligence, outputs, etc. And why should anyone favour their theory rather than anyone else's? Now, one good reason for favouring it would be that if it made unique predictions that were empirically verified. Otherwise, it's just one among many theories, part of a cacophony of theories. And I would have thought that anyone who saw how their own theory was just one of many, many others, all making similar claims to explaining everything, they'd realise there was a problem. They may not. They may just think everyone ought to listen to them, not to anyone else.
Yeah.
But they'd find it very hard to persuade anyone because anyone who wanted to could look at all these other theories and why would they pick this one rather than that one? And the fact is most people aren't very interested in reading about theories. Most people are actually more interested in facts or experiences.
It's an interesting idea to have it all out there and then just to classify it somehow. But on the other hand, there is already so much out there, and one of the problems is that there's always some research that kind of backs up what you want to say. So I don't know, there's something there as well, and that's even within mainstream science. There's such a plethora of possibilities. And people could say the same thing about morphic resonance. Oh yeah, you've got some empirical evidence, but here's 20 other papers debunking it somehow. So what's your way of...
Well, I think in the end, what really makes something real is if it can be applied and used. I mean, I'm English. I suppose this is a kind of utilitarian type of argument. no one's going to argue about electromagnetism or radio waves if they've got a mobile phone that works or a computer that works. If it were possible to train people to get really good at telepathy, for example, and then have international telepathy contests or telepathy Olympics and have people winning because they're really telepathic under controlled conditions, because obviously if it's an international contest, you have to rule out cheating. Like in regular Olympic Games, you rule out doping and as much as you can and so on. So if people were winning prizes for accomplishments that clearly were telepathic, then the question, does telepathy exist or is it just another theory? That question would go away. It would become a socially accepted fact. So if morphic resonance could be applied in new technologies or in evolutionary biology or in new learning systems, facilitated learning using morphic resonance that actually works better than other learning systems, then I think it would just simply become normal. Because although there are lots of opinions, there aren't lots of varying opinions about smartphones or how computers work or how jet planes work. I mean, you may have people saying it's all a conspiracy, there aren't really jet planes, they don't really fly, but that's so obviously incredible because they do fly, and whatever the theory, they work.
And the moment you want to go on a holiday, then the conspiracy theory doesn't matter too much.
Exactly. So that's why I think there's a kind of reality check to all these things.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. I'm starting to get the feeling that I'm trying to pry for something or to get something out of you, which is a certain type of principle that you applied. And perhaps it's just a character trait, because I'm thinking about your experiments with the crop circles. And it's one of the things that I always appreciated so much about you, that, well, there is this phenomenon, people are intrigued, there's a whole field of people claiming all sorts of things about the crop circles, and then what do? Oh, you just find the people who, what was it, you wrote out in The Guardian, I believe, this kind of contest, and then everybody could try, and if they could show that it's humanly possible to make such complex crop circles, then that would mean something, and they actually did, and so on. So you set up the experiment.
Yes, set up the experiment. It was the International Crop Circle Making Contest, the first and last.
It's brilliant, but nobody would think of doing such a thing, and that's what I'm trying to get at. Is that just your character? You wake up and you think, that's the way to experiment with crop circles, so let's do that because that's the way I am. I'm an experimenting guy. Or is there something that you can teach other people how to retain that mindset and not just go in the flow with all the people who are so enamored with the crop circles? You just think, let's test them.
Well, and do the experiment. It's just a simple scientific principle. It's not something very original with me. But I mean, most scientists back off crop circles. It's new age, it's flaky and stuff.
See, that's the other side, of course. That's the science side.
But here's something actually happening. And then the predominant theory at the time was that humans couldn't make these. They're too complex for humans to make. That was the usual consensus view, which led to people saying, are they done by flying saucers, UFOs, aliens, teleportation, mass psychokinesis, and so forth, all sorts of fantastical theories. So the question really was, can humans make crop circles on these fairly complex designs? So we asked the people who had these theories, what do you think humans couldn't do? So we came up with a standard design which included rings with no mark in the middle, circles with small circles where there's no sign of anyone trampling through the crop to make the circle there. And so we had all the things that are supposedly impossible for people to do. We made a design that incorporated them, that was similar to the kinds of things that were appearing in fields. And we then said, this is a competition. There's a German magazine. I met some people from a German magazine who offered to put up the prize money, £3,000. So we had a £3,000 prize for the team that made the best crop circle under supervised conditions. We had everyone gather in a field. We rented a field from a farmer, we laid it out in 12 equal-sized plots. We had 11 teams in the contest. They started at 10 p.m. when it was getting dark. They had to be out of the field by 3 a.m. We had guards to prevent sabotage of other people's crop circles. We had then a guard until dawn to stop any interference. We had a helicopter come over at dawn to take aerial photos. We had an international team of judges. By midday, they announced the winner. Then there was a lunch break. Everyone went to the local pub. And at 3 p.m., the winning team had to make the circle again in the 12th remaining plot. And that was open to the public and TV crews and the media. And people were charged £1 to come in so that they could witness the winning team make the crop circle again in broad daylight, which they did. And so we could all see how they did it. And it was very ingenious. They had plastic tubing with string that they put the string through the tubing and rolled it with their feet as a kind of roller. To get into the center of an area with no trampling marks, they had 2 lightweight aluminium ladders and a plank. So lowered one ladder into the crop, and then had the other one, put the plank across, crawled across the plank, went down the ladder, made the circle, came back, lifted the ladder out, and there was a perfect circle with no footprints going in and out. So
Lovely.
They had ingenious methods. And the team of 3 young men who won it were helicopter engineers from Westland Helicopters in Somerset. So, it was fun. It was written up in The Guardian, and we had BBC radio programs about it, and they had a radio correspondent actually at the contest. It was on the farming program at 6 a.m. with a reporter on the scene with the sound of the helicopter going over, taking the photos and so on. Mm-hmm. and what it showed was that all these supposedly impossible to do features could in fact be done quite easily by human teams.
See, and that for me is also interesting. It's not as if then you became known as the debunking skeptic who shows that such phenomena are humanly possible and not.
Well, the thing is, what I said when I was interviewed is that, it shows that these things could be made by humans. It doesn't prove they all are.
No, of course.
So it is possible to forge a £50 note that looks just like a real one. That doesn't prove that all £50 notes are forgeries.
Yeah.
So,
true.
I mean, it advanced the debate. Mm-hmm. So then, after that, there was a general acceptance that many of them could be made by people. Then people said there's a small minority that are genuine. So then how do you tell the genuine minority from the others? And then the people who believe they're genuine said, well, we're not going to tell you how we know they're genuine because then the hoaxers would know how to deceive us. And so I lost interest in the debate at that point. But this really did make a difference to the discussion about crop circles, which was a kind of national obsession here in Britain.
Of course, it brings us a bit back to what you said before. Why do you lose interest in the end? What's the use of a crop circle? Not a lot. So why would we bother?
Well, I mean, I see them as interesting, and I've for years afterwards, and still now, I buy crop circle calendars every year, because I think that they're very interesting forms of landscape art. I mean, they're ingenious designs, they're interesting patterns, and assuming they are all made by people, here we have a form of installation of landscape art which requires no state subsidy, involves no expensive dealers, no galleries, no billionaires competing to own it. It's a wonderful form of literally grassroots art.
That's true. That's very true. Another project of yours I was thinking about, not just the project, but the way you have always handled your research and also the criticisms on it and the way you navigated your difficult position. And that's the whole what I'm trying to say is on your website, you always have your own articles, the criticisms on your own articles, and then the way you replied. It's all there. Anybody who wants to see for themselves can find it all on your website. And it's pretty elaborate when it comes to your video about your assistant's dog. And that was shown on TV, I think. And then you had this famous skeptic trying to debunk it all and so on. So it's a whole debate back and forward. And again, people can go and see it. But that, for me, that's the other aspect of what we're talking about. That's this huge skepticism, which is also there, and which doesn't even allow for real empirical evidence to become evidence. I mean, generally accepted evidence, because it was pretty clear to me if you see everything and if you count everything up. And how does that make you feel? I never had the feeling that it makes you angry or anything, or did it make you angry? But that's not for the camera or the podcast, or
Well,
how do you deal
sometimes
with
I
that?
found it very irritating when people made claims that were simply not true.
Yeah.
It makes me angry when people who claim to be scientists say things that are simply not true and are plainly dishonest and claim the authority of science for it, because I think that's hypocritical and actually damaging to the scientific endeavor.
Mm-hmm.
So I certainly found that irritating at the least.
Mm-hmm.
But on the whole, I've been attacked for years by skeptics, and I know most of them personally. I've had debates with most of them personally as well. And basically where they're coming from is a materialist belief system that simply regards these phenomena as impossible. So as far as they're concerned, telepathy, for example, or morphic resonance simply cannot exist because the world, as they understand it, would not allow this to happen. And if it does happen, it would upset their view of the world and it would allow a lot of things they're against, like psychic phenomena or even religious practices, to be meaningful. So their whole worldview and personal identity depends on denying these phenomena.
Mm-hmm.
So they deny them. And they sometimes deny them by quibbling about the experimental details, or the statistics are faulty, or there's this fault here or there. But that is now not the usual way they attack the evidence. They now attack it on the grounds simply that it's impossible, and therefore it's invalid, and you don't need to waste time looking at it. I mean, this is the view, for example, of Steven Pinker, who wrote a book 2 years ago called Rationality. In his book, Rationality, he argues that psychic phenomena are impossible, and therefore the prior Bayesian probability of them actually existing is about 1 in 100 million. So you'd need 100 million times more evidence than you would for anything else to prove these things exist. And because they're impossible, there shouldn't be any funding for this research. And therefore, and people who do it should be attacked and stuff. So anyway, basically his argument is that they're impossible, therefore there's no point wasting time looking at the evidence. So I challenged him to a public debate. And finally he responded saying he hadn't got the bandwidth to do it. And I said, what does that mean? And he said, well, if he took part in a debate about the evidence, he'd have to read the evidence first. He hadn't got time to do that. So, I mean, to that, the simple response is that this is almost the definition of prejudice. Prejudice means prejudging something without looking at the evidence. So it's his minuscule Bayesian prior probability is not a scientific statement. If anything, it's just a measure of the degree of his prejudice. It quantifies prejudice.
There's something interesting here, that prejudice in the way you define it now, prejudgment, this, I know beforehand what the reality is going to be or what the reality is. It seems the same whether you're a skeptic like Steven Pinker on the scientific side or you're the intuitive thinking spiritualist. It's a bit the same thing. You're already convinced of whatever the experiment is going to prove or not prove. You're convinced beforehand and you don't need to look at the proof because it takes time.
Yes.
And it might go against whatever you want.
But it's a form of fundamentalism.
Yeah.
I mean, fundamentalists in religion and in science both think they know the truth already. And I suppose some intuitives think they know the truth already because it's been directly revealed to them. They usually have a smaller following unless they're gurus and actually do have a following. But in Steven Pinker's case, he's appealing to a consensus view that's been there for generations about mechanistic materialism, which is basically the orthodoxy of institutional science, or indeed of academia in general.
But again, on a personal level or an emotional level, how do you deal with it? Because I find it difficult, certainly these days, where like I say, there is not a lot of common truth. There has been, materialism has been a consensus view, certainly within the scientific community, the last 100, 200 years or something. But I have the feeling that even materialism is kind of getting shaky these days. And it's not just materialism. There's lots of aspects of viewing the world, and there's lots of elements of contemporary worldviews which are getting a bit shaky, and has a lot to do with the internet, has a lot to do with political upheaval and so on. Might be lots of reasons behind it. But in any case, it's not easy to have debates about the truth because it has been hugely deconstructed, also philosophically. It doesn't necessarily make it easy on people to have debates about truth itself, because truth itself is being questioned. What you're saying is, well, empirical evidence still goes a long way, and they also think that way. Not just empirical evidence, but also logical thinking sometimes. Some arguments are better than others. I may not have the truth, but some of my arguments might be better than yours, or yours might be better than me, but you kind of have to explain why. And similarly with, well, let's look at the data. Let's look at what proofs we have. And now I come back to my emotional question, so to say. How do you deal with that? Because I get really frustrated, and I sometimes don't know in dialogues how to deal with people who are not willing to look at the evidence or even listen to the argument itself. They don't want to take the time. Do you simply get angry and then you pray and then it's gone? Or how do you...
Well, I do sometimes get angry and I do pray about it, and I do find that helps. But what I find is that most of the people who are opposed to what I do, that I have to have debates or arguments with, or who attack me, are not evil people. I mean, they're people who believe they're fighting for the truth, but they think they're basically scientific fundamentalists. They themselves lament the post-truth world. I mean, I subscribe to the Skeptical Inquirer, which is the main organ of the skeptical movement, because I like to see what they're thinking about and what they're going on about. And their website and their journal and their newsletters are a litany of objections to magical thinking and conspiracy theories, and the things they say are assaults on the truth. And I agree with them. Many of these things are assaults on the truth. But the point is that they believe that their view, mechanistic materialism, is the truth. And for years, long before the modern sort of internet-type things came along, they've been doing exactly these things. I mean, cancelling people. I mean, I've been cancelled for decades by believers in the so-called scientific truth. Denial of the evidence, belief that anyone like me who has views that differ from their own must be part of some kind of Christian or religious conspiracy to undermine science. They're the pioneers of all this kind of cancelling culture, denial of evidence. In fact, the Skeptical Inquirer and as a debunking organization is specialized in trying to debunk everything to do with psychic phenomena and religion for years, and that's what they've been doing. And the evidence doesn't play a very big part in it. Well, they can find evidence of frauds. I mean, there are people who are spiritualists who claim to be talking to the dead who are frauds. I mean, they can always point to frauds, and they do really exist, and they probably serve a useful function in exposing fraudulent mediums and so on. But basically, I see it as a conflict of ideas, and they're representatives of a particular ideology, mechanistic materialism, combined with militant atheism in many cases, which probably at some stage in European history served a useful function and were liberating forces, but have now become dogmatic, imprisoning thought forms.
Yeah.
So I just don't waste a lot of emotional energy on it now. It used to engage me more, but I just don't feel that they're playing a very important role in the contemporary debate.
That's why what I'm kind of trying to get at, you don't waste too much emotional energy on it anymore. You used to do a bit more. Is it because it has no use, in the sense that if a fundamentalist is so convinced there's no way to have a proper dialogue, or did you eventually find ways to talk with fundamentalists of any type and stripe?
Well, I do if I can. I mean, for example, I've been invited to give talks at skeptics in the pub meetings here in England.
Okay.
It's a kind of grassroots skeptical movement. I've done 2 or 3 of those, and, they're perfectly congenial people. A few of them are fanatics, but most of them are just people who are a bit lonely and like going together and have a feeling that they're with people who share some of their views, and some of them support what I'm doing. I mean, the most extreme case was when I was asked to give a talk to the European Skeptics Congress in Brussels. And I gave a talk in Ghent the night before. And someone came up to me and said, look, I'm a member of the skeptics thing, and I'm going to be at the conference tomorrow. And I liked what you said this evening. I just want to warn you, you're walking into a trap. They're going to destroy you. And I'd advise you not to go, to cancel. And I said, I can't do that. I've said I'm going. They put me on the top slot on their final session, and a debate on telepathy with a leading member of the Dutch skeptical organization, Stichting Skepsis.
Okay.
And so there I was in this European Skeptics Congress. The whole audience was skeptics, delegates from all over Europe. No one but skeptics there. And I was on the stage with this Dutch skeptic. And so, I said, you go first. So he went first, and he spent half an hour proving that psychic phenomena were impossible according to the second law of thermodynamics and the principle of conservation of energy.
Okay.
And then it was my turn, and I presented evidence for animal telepathy, dogs that know when there is a coming home, telephone telepathy, so summarizing research by other people on telepathy and stuff. And then his response to this was, none of this is of any value. He said, the more significant the results you claim, obviously, the greater the error. So I then said, well, look, would you care to take one example of these papers, just one example, and point out just what the error is? He said, do you think I'd waste my time reading this stuff? It's obviously rubbish. And some of the people in the audience were cheering him on, but others were appalled. And when it came to the break, the hall dissolved into a kind of hubbub. And some of the people came up to me and said, look, we apologize for this. We really believe in scientific evidence. Mm-hmm. We thought you gave a more scientific talk and, are actually interested in the evidence. Please don't think all skeptics are simply denialists. And we're not. And this was a shameful thing. And others were on his side and thought that I ought to be hounded out of town, as a charlatan. So the fact is, within the skeptic movement, there are people who are sincere and genuinely do believe in scientific evidence. And that's why whenever I have a chance to have a debate with a skeptic, I accept the challenge and have the debate. Yeah. My only requirement is that there's equal time on both sides and that there's some chairperson who can hold a kind of neutral, balancing role in the debate.
It makes me think that perhaps, almost coming back to one of my first questions, that there is something in your work all those years that I think might have kind of saved you or kept you grounded, in the sense that you've always been very clear about the fact that you love science and you've never posited another way of thinking over and against science. You've always wanted to expand science, and I guess your book, The Science Delusion, is the best example of it, where you show the 10, what you call dogmas of science today, but in your introduction, you're absolutely clear that the only reason why you're talking about it is to expand science because you think that it gets stuck in certain assumptions, dogmas, things taken as a matter of faith and not out of proof. And so there's something there that you do agree with the basic assumptions of the scientific method, and you have no qualms about it. And I guess that's one of the things that makes you a bit specific in all those debates, that it's eventually for you, it has a lot to do with advancing science. And then when you get into those discussions like you just described, what happens is that a mirror is put in front of certain people and they fall into their own traps because they're being hypocritical, basically. It's not like your view is another view that is supposed to be better. What you're actually showing is that they're not consistent with their own views, and that hurts them a lot more than if you would have a confrontational debate on that level, I guess.
Yes, I think one of the problems with them is the scientific fundamentalists, they need certainty. They need to feel that their view is certain. And I'm quite happy with uncertainty. I don't know if morphic resonance is true in the form I put it forward. I'd like it to be true. I've spent all these years advancing these ideas because I think they're probably truer than I don't think they're the ultimate truth. We may never know that, but I think they're truer than the mechanistic materialism.
See, that's interesting. You make even your morphic resonance, which is really your life's work, even that one is still a hypothesis for you.
Well, it's a hypothesis. It really is, yes. You see, what the skeptics can't get is that for me, it's a hypothesis. That's why I'm testing it. I mean, if I thought it was a certain truth, I wouldn't bother doing experiments. It's a hypothesis. What they can't get is the uncertainty associated with the hypothesis. For them, for the kind of skeptics who run Wikipedia and who've taken over my biography page there, the guerrilla skeptics on Wikipedia and their allies, they treat it as a claim. They say, I'm claiming that this happens, and they're going to debunk my claim. I'm not claiming it happens. I'm saying it's a hypothesis. I'm saying it's a possibility. And the only way to find out is to do the experiments. And there are some going on right now. And, who knows? The evidence so far points towards morphic resonance. I wouldn't claim it's conclusive because very little research has actually been done. So
absolutely. And it's the same with the spiritual people who are a bit too inclined to become fundamentalist in their spiritual or religious views. They also have a tendency not to see certain claims as hypotheses eventually, which you still have to think about. It all remains a mystery in the end. But luckily, most people, of course, are not fundamentalists. And I always love it when you tell that story of those. It might have happened more than once, but you always tell it as if it happened in a specific moment where you were talking to a specific set of scientists. Was it biologists who afterwards came to you? Do tell it again, the whole story.
Oh, well, I gave a talk to the sub-department of animal behaviour in the veterinary school in Cambridge about my research on dogs that know when their owners are coming home. Because one of the members of staff there was very interested in it and, in fact, edited a journal in which I published some of the results, a peer-reviewed animal behaviour journal. And he thought this would be of interest to the researchers there, even though it was controversial, the idea of dogs being telepathic. And so I gave my talk, and there were sort of polite comments, and there were about 6 academic members of staff, and then there were graduate students and undergraduates and so on. But in the tea break afterwards, one by one, the members of the academic staff came up and said, well, I really enjoyed your talk. And one of them said, I've got a dog that knows when I'm coming home from the lab. Another one said, we had a dog that did this when I was a child. One reason I got interested in animals and became a vet. And another said, I've seen this kind of thing with animals. I'm very interested in this. And they all said, I can't talk to my colleagues about it because they're all so straight. And when the professor himself came and said more or less the same thing to me, I said, why don't you guys come out? Because you'd have so much more fun. And they were all pretending to each other that they didn't believe in these things and they were hardcore materialists. And none of them were. And actually, I think that's common throughout the scientific world. I think that the the number of people who really believe in the hardcore mechanistic materialism is actually a minority now. We had some surveys done by the Scientific and Medical Network, commissioned YouGov, which is a public polling organization, to do surveys of scientists, doctors, and engineers in Britain, France, and Germany, and asking questions about their worldview, etc. And the percentage who identified as materialists was about 25% of the scientific community, and a further 20% described themselves as non-religious and non-spiritual.
Mm-hmm.
So about 45% classified themselves as non-religious and non-spiritual. But about 45% classified themselves as religious, spiritual but not religious, or spiritual and religious. Mm-hmm. So the actual mechanistic materialist atheist types was a minority, 25%. The other 20% were sort of agnostics but non-religious. So the spiritual oblique religious and non-religious were about equal numbers in the scientific and medical communities. And in Britain, France, and Germany, it was similar in different countries. France had a slightly higher percentage of atheists than the other countries, but otherwise similar. And so it's when people say the scientific community doesn't believe this or that, they've got no evidence that they're speaking for the scientific community. If they look at the actual evidence, there's no evidence the scientific community is fully committed to mechanistic materialism. And if you did a similar survey in India, for example, or in Brazil, both of which have large numbers, India has more scientists than Europe, hardly any of them would be atheists and materialists in their worldview. Almost all of them would be practicing Hindus, Muslims, Sikhs, or whatever, Parsis or Jains or Christians. So it's actually not the case that science as a whole or the scientific community has these rigid, narrow views. Loudmouth spokespeople for it, like Richard Dawkins, claim to speak for the scientific community, but actually they don't. And that's why I think it would be a good thing for members of the scientific community, people who actually work in science, engineering, medicine, and related fields, to know that most of their colleagues are not likely to be hardcore materialists. A few of them certainly will be, but most will probably not be. And if they speak more freely, they'd realize that actually they're not alone.